Yesterday night, I was doing my normal run on Uber Eats at around 9 p.m. to make some extra money since I'm paying off my student loans. After about 7 runs, I got a hit for 7533 Laconia Street. It was about a 15-minute drive from where I was, but it had a $30 tip, so I was willing to do it and got directions. Something weirded me out when I looked at the directions. Laconia Street had no outlet, which wouldn't have weirded me out if it wasn't the only road on this particular part of East Philadelphia, and the fact there was an abundance of missing posters leading up to the street, but I just ignored it as being a bad part of the city. I arrived at the location, and something immediately felt off. The street had no streetlights, and I could barely see anything without my headlights, so I just kept them on while I went to the house. The sidewalk was broken and very damaged, like it hadn't been taken care of in years. I faintly saw the 7533 next to the door of one of the houses, so I went up and dropped the food off. After I took the photo, I began walking to my car, when I noticed the headlights were off. I didn't remember turning them off, so I was confused. I began walking to my car, and then I heard a door slam from up the street. I turned around and heard another door slam. I turned on my car and turned on the headlights when I saw 2 men standing in the road. They both looked sickly, with pale skin, black eyes, and very skinny. But they were just standing there. Then I noticed one of them looked familiar, like I saw him somewhere recently. I honked my horn and yelled at them to see if they needed anything, but they just stood there, standing. Then I froze. The men were now smiling wide like they thought something was funny. I just sat there scared. I didn't want to drive off because I was scared one of them might have had a gun or something. Right when I was about to get out of there, I heard a shuffle in my back seat. I stopped breathing and looked in my rearview mirror. The eyes in the mirror stared back at me, and I felt something begin to grab my shoulder. Without thinking, I opened the door and jumped out of the car. As I felt someone leap forward and hit my dashboard, I ran up the street and heard a rapid pair of footsteps behind me, laughing like crazy. I ran down the long road until I found a small town and called an Uber to my house. On the way back to my house, I thought more about those missing posters and how all of them were on the way to Laconia Street. I thought about who those people were or what they wanted from me. I never bothered calling the police because I would sound crazy to them. The next morning I called an Uber to drive back to that street and pick up my car, which I examined closely before I entered. There was a dent on the middle console, but for the most part, it was clean. I drove home. If this advice even helps one food delivery person, that's all that matters. I don't know if those were homeless people, crackheads, or whatever those people were, but something was going to happen if I hadn't looked in the mirror, and I might have been on one of those missing posters. I hope this helps. It was 2015. My sister and I are home alone watching Craigslist horror stories on YouTube. A bit ironic, I know. Now for reference, I was 13 while my sister was 17, and having these watch parties had become something of a habit as it was our last year together before she went off to college. We lived in a safe neighborhood, and nothing had ever really happened at that point that would give us any reason to be anxious about being alone. Anyways, time goes on, and my sister suggests we order a pizza since she's starving. I'm not one to turn down a pizza, so I naturally agree, and we place an order at a local pizza place. We continue watching our videos for another 20 minutes before I step out to use the restroom. Just then, I hear the doorbell ring followed by my sister getting up to go answer it. So I carry on with my business, with the assumption it was just the pizza. I'd say only 2 minutes had passed as I come back and realize my sister was still at the door talking with someone. I couldn't make out what was being said, but I knew it was a man's voice responding to her. As I go to see what's going on, my sister promptly shuts the door, pizza in hand. I initially assumed maybe there was just an issue with the payment, so I just teased my sister for taking so long and go sit down. It didn't take long for me to realize, though, that my sister wasn't eating, despite this whole thing being her idea, and even more so, She had a very nervous look on her face now, and wasn't speaking much. I asked her what was up, and she proceeds to tell me that when she opened the door to greet the pizza guy, he looked at her as if he was checking her out, and followed up by giving her the most unsettling smile she's ever seen. She was just trying to get the pizza and go as we had already paid online, but the creep insisted on trying to make conversation with her. The man pretended to fumble around trying to get the pizza box out of his bag, all while asking very personal questions that he certainly had no business asking, like how old she was, and if she was alone. Now, I admittedly thought she was just messing with me. I mean, stuff like that can never actually happen to people you know, right? Nevertheless, it still left me feeling a bit anxious. We tried to enjoy the food and move on, and I'd say about an hour or two later we had finally calmed down about the whole thing. Right as we were getting ready to clean up and go back to our rooms, there was a knock at the door, a very loud and aggressive one at that. We share the same nervous look, then hesitantly slip over to a window to see if we can get a look at whoever's knocking. Now I hadn't seen the guy, but my sister immediately recognized him as the pizza guy from before. We were contemplating calling the police, but the guy only knocked once or twice more before getting in his car and taking off way too fast down the road, almost like he knew if he continued, he was more than likely going to end up in a lot of trouble. We made a round around the house, making sure everything was locked up, and then waited for what felt like ages for our parents to finally get home. My sister told them about what happened, but our mom insisted we were just being dramatic, that we had just made ourselves nervous because of the videos we were always watching. While we both initially insisted on being serious, we eventually just gave up and tried to move on from the whole thing. We ordered from that place a few more times, but thankfully never saw that same delivery man again. Nothing else ever came of the situation. But I can't help but think about what could have happened if that creep had been just a bit more persistent. What if he had kept trying to get into the house? Or if we had accidentally left the door unlocked? I think his intentions were obvious, and I can only hope that his behavior has caught up with him, and that he's somewhere getting the help that he most definitely needs. I work as a pizza delivery man. I haven't dealt with anything too excessive, maybe a few rude customers here and there, but overall most of my experiences have been overwhelmingly positive. That is until last night. I had gotten a late-night delivery to some house out in the middle of the woods. There was a neighborhood there that I was very familiar with, but all the houses were so far apart and separated by so many trees, any single house could easily pass as its own cabin-in-the-woods type story. I had grown accustomed to travel through back roads in the dead of night, though, so that didn't faze me. I simply put the address into my GPS and left. It was an unusual night, and I couldn't see any addresses on any of the houses, so I had to rely on my GPS to tell me when I got to the house. I even ended up passing it a few times, and having to turn around. The GPS was acting up, and the only reason I could tell it was the house was a man standing at the end of the long wooded driveway flagging me down. Customers will frequently do this if they have an address that's hard to read, or no address marking at all. So it was a nice sentiment. I pulled up, and the man smiled at me and walked back to the house as I followed behind him. He then entered, shutting the door behind him, which confused me, but he easily could have just been getting his wallet. While I waited outside, I began to examine the house. It's old, weeds have overtaken it, and pieces of board are straight up just snapped. Overall, I felt bad for the old man. His house looked abandoned. I sat and waited, and he never came out. I decided to knock to remind him of my presence, and as soon as I did, a banging began on another door to the left. This, of course, startled me, but I easily shook it off as a dog, as things like this happen all the time, but it wasn't barking, just banging on the door. I could hear its claws scratch at the door with every bang, and it just kept getting louder and more intense. I stood alone in the dark, a little freaked out, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I knocked a few more times, but every time the banging on the door got more and more intense. Finally, it went silent. I heard the doorknob turn. Not the front doorknob, the door to the left that the dog was banging on. It wasn't a smooth motion either. It sounded like someone playing with the doorknob until it finally clicked. Could the dog have accidentally hit it? The door creaked open and I was met with a face coming out from the side of the door. It was A dog's face? I couldn't tell. It was dark, and all I could make out was a stark white face with large black beady eyes and a small black dot at the center I assumed was a snout. However, it couldn't have been a dog. From where the head was peeking out, it must have been at least 5'5", and it was perfectly sideways, as if some person was simply peeking out the door trying to conceal the rest of their body. Suddenly I heard a faint whisper tell me, "I'm sorry about that wait. Your money is right inside here. I'll take the food." It was dark, and I could barely see. I've never had a bad experience. So as freaked out as I was, I chalk it up to my being unable to properly see this man's face and begin approaching him. That's when I noticed the door had a number on it. 4,121. I quickly checked the receipt to see it says 4,221. Finally, an excuse to get out of here without seeming rude. I politely tell the person that I just checked and I have the wrong address and walk back to my car, refusing to look back. Once I get in my car, I glance over to the door to see the man standing outside the door, staring me down. Same disturbing dog-like face as before. But now that he's standing, I can see his very tall figure and very much human shape. I calmly backed out and left for the actual house I was meant to go to and apologized for its late delivery. I explained to them the error I made and then relayed to them how confused I was that that guy seemed to also have ordered a pizza. They laughed about it, and I got a pretty nice tip, and I returned to the store. I then told my manager the story, and he looked at me confused. There was no delivery to 4,121, and we're the only pizza place that delivers in miles. Hell, we're the only restaurant that delivers in miles. So why was this man or thing so ready to accept me into his home? Why was some other man standing at the end of the driveway ready to wave me down and invite me?